I've been dealing with requirements for many years. I've given well over 300 presentations on requirements topics. I've worked with over 100 companies of all sorts and government agencies of all sorts to help them improve how they deal with requirements. And the thing that I found is that everybody is wrestling with the same kinds of issues. I mean, this is a hard area. And we have a lot of techniques available that can help us do a better job, but I found that there are certain topics that come up over and over and over as points of confusion, points where people just aren't quite sure what to do. And for many of these things, there is no perfect solution. Unfortunately, for many of them, you just have to rely on experience and judgment, which is why having experienced and trained business analysts is such an important part of successful software development and requirements management. So what I want to do today is just share with you some thoughts about some of these topics, some of these thorny issues that are chronic points of trouble for so many organizations, and try to give you some ideas about how to deal with them if you encounter them in your environment. So at the end of this presentation, I'm not able to, here we go. We're going to, first of all, talk a little bit about how detailed do requirements need to be? You know, people often ask me, well, how detailed should I make the requirements? And I can't give you the single correct answer because there is no single correct answer. There's a thought process you can go through, though, and we'll talk about that thought process. We're going to talk about another very important area and a fuzzy area, which is the border between requirements and design. And, you know, it's not a sharp line. It's a fuzzy line, and I'll give you some ideas, and we'll maybe do a little practice activity on that to think about how do you tell if something is a requirement or a design. I'm going to describe 4 techniques for representing project scope. Everybody talks about scope. Everybody wrestles with scope. And yet, there's really not a lot written about, so what is scope? How do we represent that information so that other people understand what is and is not in scope for a particular project or an iteration? When people talk about writing requirements, they naturally think in terms of natural language text. But when I say writing requirements, what I really mean is representing requirements knowledge. And there's this really rich array of techniques we have available to represent requirements knowledge that goes far beyond the traditional approach of natural language text. And I'm going to describe some of those and tell you why that's such a valuable thing to incorporate into your requirement specification activities. People very naturally focus on functionality. What's the system do? What does the system let a user do? But non-functional requirements are a very important part of requirement specification. Again, one where I see people, by and large, not doing a very good job. So I'll tell you a little bit about what those things are and why they're so important to helping you develop the right software. Another topic that I think is really useful and I've been excited about for many years is use cases. And the Agile community has taken the same slant on that by talking about user stories. So my comments there will certainly relate to that approach as well. But one of the things people struggle with is, okay, so I've got these use cases, but that's not always enough information for the developers. So how do I relate that to the functional requirements that developers really implement? So I'll give you some thoughts about those as well. So we're going to cover quite a few of these topics here fairly quickly and not in great depth, but enough to try to give you some ideas about how you can do a better job with wrestling with these particular issues. Now, here's the way some people approach requirements in their project. It's a very old cartoon. Let me point out this is not a process description. It's what we call a cartoon. You know, the manager says, I'll go up and find out what they need, and the rest of you start coding. And maybe this is how things work in your area. But one person suggested to me that the manager should be saying, now that you're done coding, I'll go up and find out what they need, which is how it works some places also. And I showed this at one company. I'm not kidding. Somebody said, wow, that would be a lot better than what we do. I found that very frightening. I didn't even want to know what they did, so I just moved on. But, you know, we can do a lot better than this now. We have better ways to approach requirements than that kind of historical and stereotypical approach. So let's begin by thinking about how detailed do the requirements need to be. And as usual in software development, the answer to this question is it depends. It depends on a variety of factors. And that, of course, assumes we could even mention or describe what we mean by detail. How do you measure detail? You know, it's really a subjective judgment of whether the developer and tester and other people who have to do work based on the requirements, whether they have adequate information to do their job effectively reducing the need to have to do extensive and unplanned rework. So the real central question to consider when you're deciding how detailed to make your requirements is, who do you want to have making decisions about requirements details, and when do you want them making those decisions? If you're willing to defer many of the ultimate specific decisions about product capabilities and characteristics to the developers, then you don't need to include as much detail in the requirements documentation. However, if you want to ensure that you get exactly what people expect, then you need more comprehensive specifications. And this is particularly important if you don't have opportunities for frequent interactions among the project participants to resolve issues and questions as they come up. Now, you should not expect that even the best written requirements documentation can or should replace human dialogue. Requirements is at least as much about communication as it is about technology and computing. And that communication has to be an ongoing process that engages a lot of stakeholders in a just-in-time kind of basis to resolve issues as efficiently as possible. But what I can share with you are some of the factors that would argue for putting more detail into the requirement spec, or factors that would suggest that maybe it's okay and not risky to include less detail. So let's look at some of those factors that can make a difference. The first issue we'll consider then is under what circumstances can you get away with less detail in some kind of a shared group memory where we're recording information. And that can be in a traditional requirement specification. It could be in the database of a requirements management tool. It could be in an Excel spreadsheet or a wiki or note cards or whatever you're using. But you still have to decide, when have I written down enough information for the developers? So if you're in a situation where you do have extensive ongoing customer involvement, what people think of as an on-site customer, for example, or other places where people can get questions answered quickly, then you don't need to write down as much. And I can give you a very interesting example of that in just a minute that I think will really bring that home. If you have developers who have a lot of domain experience, they really understand the things that the customers are going to do, then there's a lot of tacit knowledge they already have, and you don't need to write down as much of that. If you've got precedents available, if you're building the next version of an existing application, if you're building something to replace an existing application, then those precedents can provide a lot of information that doesn't necessarily have to be duplicated in the form of requirement specification. If you're going to be using a packaged solution, a commercial off-the-shelf system for all or part of your solution, then you don't need to write down as much detail. There's no point in specifying the requirements for a package if the package already exists. Now, there certainly is other information you're going to have to record to make sure you can choose the right package, to make sure you can customize it, tailor it, extend it, and so forth to meet the needs. But there's no point in just reiterating the requirements of the package itself. Now, in other conditions, you really have to think about whether it's a good idea to write down more detailed information. If you're outsourcing development, if you've got people in other locations who you're going to mail requirements to and they're going to build it, you absolutely have to be careful to include enough information there to reduce the risk of them zigging when they should have zagged and you having to spend a lot of money and time and effort to rebuild the product correctly. If the team is geographically dispersed, then it's important to have more detail. And it takes remarkably little physical separation to a communications barrier in this area. So let me tell you that story, kind of relating back to the idea of extensive customer involvement, which ties into this geographically dispersed idea as well. Many, many years ago, I was writing software for a scientist at Kodak. I was also a scientist at Kodak. This was early in my career when I was transitioning from being a chemist to being a software developer. And I sat about 10 feet apart. We had a common doorway, and I could see if John was sitting at his desk. And as I was working on this software